Hello and welcome back to Pete's Behavioral Insights and Theories, aka Pete's Bits. In today's video we're going to be rating 14 different cognitive biases, heuristics, mental shortcuts, whatever you want to call them. We're going to be rating them in a tier list. Now, is this a stupid video? Yes. But is it also a lot of fun? Also yes. So while ranking different heuristics is a really stupid idea because how effective each of these different ideas is highly dependent on the situation in which you're applying it and of course the skill of the choice architect to make it effective. But we're going to rank them anyway because it's just a bit of fun. Alright, let's jump into it. Okay, so here we have our tier list. If you don't know how tier lists work, basically S is the best, and D is the worst. We have 14 different cognitive biases down below. We have mental accounting, present bias, priming, salience, social norms, habits, the IKEA effect, ambiguity, aversion, anchoring, authority bias, commitment devices, defaults, empathy gap, and framing. So the criteria I'm using for rating these is firstly, how powerful do I think they are in changing people's behavior? And two, how flexible or versatile are they? So how many different types of problems can you apply the same idea to? And if you can apply it to more different problems, so if it's more flexible, then it gains points. So efficacy and flexibility are the two main criteria. Okay, so the first one here is mental accounting. So mental accounting is the idea that we tend to actually separate money in our minds depending on what we intend to spend that money on. So rather than just having one big pot of money, which is what we actually have in reality, because money is what we describe as fungible, instead we tend to think of money as separated. So we have money for our electric bills, we have money for our grocery shopping, and we have money for gifts. And these are separate pots of money, so we tend to spend according to what pot we've allocated that money to. This can be exploited, for example, by car salesmen. So when you go to buy a car, it's a very large, expensive purchase, and a good car salesman should try to push you to make more add-ons. Now, in reality, these add-ons aren't actually that cheap, but because the price of those add-ons is relative to the car, so basically it's a small fish in a big mental account, we tend to not feel the pain of those large purchases, whereas if we were to rethink of the issue in terms of what else could we buy with that same money, maybe we'd be less willing to get those extra add-ons. So mental accounting is a pretty neat idea. It can be used in some interventions, but I think because it's a very strictly financial idea, I'm just going to put it in the B category. So right in the middle of the road. It's a pretty neat idea if you get it to work, but you can't really use it in that many different situations. So next up we have present bias, and I have a picture of marshmallows on the front here because of course the most famous example of a study on present bias is the marshmallow experiment, which I talked about in an earlier video. And in the marshmallow experiment, 4-year-olds were asked to resist eating one marshmallow for about 10 minutes so that they could have 2 marshmallows at the end of the 10 minutes. And what present bias is talking about is something which we all experience, which is overvaluing short-term rewards rather than long-term benefits. And you could think about how this relates to dieting or, for example, exercise. So you could think about Katie Milkman's temptation bundling, for example. So going to the gym is not rewarding for everyone in the immediate term, and the big long-term reward of better health isn't really enough to motivate people often. So what we can do is we can get people to go to the gym, and while they're in the gym, they do something else which is rewarding at the same time, like listen to their favorite podcast, their favorite album, or maybe watch their favorite behavioral science YouTuber. So by pairing something which is rewarding in the short term with something which is rewarding in the long term, where we feel more motivated to do that thing which is rewarded in the long term. So present bias is a pretty neat idea, it's pretty powerful, and I also think it's applicable to a lot of different behavioral problems that we might encounter, because a lot of the time we don't do things because it doesn't feel rewarding in the short term. So I'm going to put present bias in the A category. Next up we have priming. Priming belongs in the D category. So if you haven't seen my video on priming, you might be thinking, why am I so dismissive of this subject, and how come I'm putting it straight in the bottom tier of our tier list? Well, let me explain what it is first. So the reason why there's a picture of an old man with a Zimmer frame on the front is because the most famous study on priming is about a study on students who were asked to read some words to do with old people, Zimmer frame, geriatric, and Florida, because this study was taking place in the US. And after they read these words related to old people, the researchers claimed that they observed the participants walking more slowly down the hallway afterwards, as if they were a more old person. And we've seen similar sorts of ideas with if you introduce a fishy smell into a room, then people become more suspicious, or if you make the room colder, then people tend to act more hostile or cold to each other. And all of these things have failed replications. Really, really hysterically poor replication results. And so I think that priming in general, even if you do get it to work in some capacity, it's not like it's going to have a huge effect size compared to some of these other things that we're talking about. And so for that reason, priming is going straight to the bottom in the D category. Next up, we have salience. So salience is a pretty poorly defined term in behavioral science, but I like to think of it as making things that are important stand out. So this is a super basic concept which is applied in a lot of different behavioral interventions, because a lot of the time we'll be redesigning letters or emails or websites or apps, and what we're doing is we're trying to make the most important information the most obvious and clear to the customer. Now, in my opinion, salience is one of the most important behavioral science ideas, because from my experience, when people are new to behavioral science and they learn about all these different nudges and cognitive biases, what they try and do is they try to fit in all of these ideas at once into their intervention, and then their intervention ends up being really rubbish because they lose the most important part of any intervention, and that is your intervention being salient, the desired behavior being obvious to the person you're trying to reach. So salience, I think, is actually going straight into S tier. If the desired behavior isn't salient, it won't work. And of course, this principle applies to all behavioral interventions. Next up, we have another one that's going straight into S tier, and that is social norms. So I have a picture of a sheep here because social norms is about following the crowd or being a sheep. Now this goes straight into S tier because you could argue that the ultimate goal of a lot of our behavioral interventions is to establish a new social norm, because by establishing a new social norm, that's what's going to allow your behavior change to perpetuate into the future. Now usually if you're going to be using social norming directly in your intervention, you're going to be using it in a way that reminds your target audience of which social group you want them to be thinking about. And that tends to be the most effective way to evoke social norms in people. So for example, if a hotel wants you to reuse your towels more than once, rather than say, most people reuse their towels, which would technically be a social norm, a more effective way to do that intervention would be to say, 70% of people who stay in your room that you're in right now reuse their towels more than once. And by putting you in the same category as other people, they are developing a much stronger social norm, creating a much stronger identity within you, and that's what's going to make social norming a more potent intervention. But nevertheless, because social norms apply to almost all of our behavioral interventions, and is really the ultimate goal of all behavioral interventions, social norming, of course, belongs in S tier. Next up, we have habits. Now, you might not think of habits as a mental shortcut, but really they are, according to the psychological research. So a habit is basically just connecting a behavior to an environment or a context, so that when we go into that context, that behavior automatically comes to mind. Now, in my opinion, habits belong in S tier because habits are so powerful. The reason why habits are powerful is because they're long-term changes to people's behavior. And of course, if that same behavior is repeated, then the impact of that behavior gets compounded over time. So using a different bias or heuristic to get someone to go to the gym once, that's great. That's great, they went to the gym once. But if you establish a new gym habit in someone, they're going to go to the gym week after week after week, year after year after year, and of course the effect of that repeated action is going to be far greater than any kind of one-time intervention. So for that reason, because habits are so powerful, they're going into S tier. Alright, next up we have the IKEA effect. So the IKEA effect is one of the most popular videos on my channel. It has over 1,100 views already. And the IKEA effect is a pretty cool idea. So if you haven't seen my video or you don't know what the IKEA effect is, then here's a little reminder. So the IKEA effect is people valuing a product more because they had some role in its creation. So for example, when you go to IKEA and you buy their furniture, you have to build the furniture yourself. And what the IKEA effect says is that because you built the furniture yourself, you actually value it more than if you were to buy that same furniture made by somebody else. Now, the IKEA effect is used in the world of business all the time in IKEA, but also you can think of Legos, or you can think of custom designed trainers from Nike, for example. These are all examples of the use of the IKEA effect, giving people a role in the creation of the product to make them value it more. But in terms of behavioral interventions, there are very few examples that I can think of where the IKEA effect has actually been used well. In fact, the only one which I can think of is from Rory's book Alchemy, where he talks about using the IKEA effect to promote use of a detergent in developing countries. That's something that he and the team at Ogilvy did. So basically what they did was they had this detergent that allowed people in third world countries to only wash their clothes once rather than 3 times, which is what used to be necessary. Now, while this is a really fantastic product, it's almost too good to be true, and so a lot of the locals didn't really believe that it was effective. So what Rory and the team at Ogilvy did was they created a new bucket, which was a little bit more complicated and required extra steps to complete, and this gratuitous amount of effort made it feel like it was more effective, as well as being more effective. And so that's how the IKEA effect can be used well. However, I'm going to put it in C tier, and the reason why I'm putting it so low down is because I just think it's really, really niche. Because essentially what you're doing with the IKEA effect is you're adding friction to the behavior. And usually when it comes to behavioral intervention, we're trying to remove friction to make that behavior easier. And it's in very select circumstances where we want to increase the friction and increase the effort in order to make the product more effective. So I think the IKEA effect is more useful in the world of business and product design, but in terms of behavioral intervention, probably not as versatile as we would like. Alright, next up we have ambiguity aversion, and I don't know if you can see this, but the little picture I have at the bottom is a famous optical illusion where some people see a rabbit and some people see a duck, depending on which side you look at. So ambiguity aversion, or so you can think of it also as uncertainty aversion, is basically the idea that people just hate not knowing what the truth is. They hate being uncertain, they hate having ambiguity. And this is just a really powerful idea. And of course, we've been experiencing a lot of ambiguity aversion in 2020 with so much uncertainty about what the future holds. And it's a really horrible feeling. Now, as an example of how ambiguity aversion might be used in the field, I did some work with Warwick Estates, where they were running a tournament to get people to reduce the amount of energy and water they were using in student accommodation. Now, that sounds like a really good idea. The problem was that on their posters, they said that if you did well in the competition, you would win prizes. And I told them that this was too ambiguous a reward. Win prizes? Like, how much were the students winning? When were they winning it? And did they have to divide it amongst the team? All of these questions were left unanswered. And so what we can expect from ambiguity aversion is that people will either feel uncomfortable if they have to participate in it, and if they don't have to participate in something which is ambiguous, they'll probably just ignore you. And that's exactly what the folks at Warwick Estates were finding out, was that the students were just ignoring them because, in my opinion, their rewards were too ambiguous. And so a behavioral intervention would be just to be correcting these ambiguous terminologies. And really, it's low-hanging fruit. It's low-hanging fruit for a lot of behavioral interventions. It's a free lunch, and for that reason, it's super versatile and powerful in the sense that you're just solving a really basic problem, and therefore I'm putting it in A tier, right next to present bias. Alright, next up we have anchoring. Now, you might have heard of anchoring from Thinking Fast and Slow. Anchoring is the idea that people overweight the first piece of information they hear, and that influences their decision making later on. And we've seen anchoring come into play a lot during the coronavirus lockdown period. If you think about the hoarding behavior that we were observing, people overbuying things in the supermarket, one of the regulations that were implemented was supermarkets were limiting the number of products that people could buy. So people were hoarding things like toilet paper and packets of dried pasta, and so the supermarket would say you're only allowed 2 per person. Now, the problem with anchoring was that by suggesting that people are only allowed 2 per person, people who went into the supermarket only intending to buy 1 packet of pasta would actually leave the store with 2 because they were anchored to that number 2 that they heard from the limiting factor. So anchoring is pretty powerful, I don't think it's super versatile in all situations, and so I'm just going to put it in B tier. If you can get it to work well, it's really, really cool, but it's not that versatile. Alright, next up we have authority bias. So if you've read Cialdini's Influence, this is probably where you've heard of authority bias talked about the most evidently. Authority bias is basically the idea that we respect messages that come from people of authority than from your average Joe. This is often used in advertising, so the example that I always use is Sensodyne, the toothpaste company, using dentists to deliver the message that Sensodyne is the best toothpaste. Because of course a dentist is an authority on dental health, and therefore they have some authority, and so we will listen to them. Authority bias is pretty easy to implement in a lot of situations, especially when it comes to any kind of messaging intervention. If you're sending a letter or an email to someone to get them to change their behavior, using authority bias can really, really help you in that situation. However, I don't think it's as powerful as some of these other ideas, and I also don't think it's that versatile. So again, it's debatable whether I put it in B or C. I'm just going to leave it in B. You guys can let me know in the comments whether you agree or disagree. Okay, next up we have commitment devices. Now it's quite a small image, I know, but what we have here is Odysseus from Greek mythology being tied to the mast of his ship while the sirens sing their songs. And if you don't know the story, basically Odysseus was traveling with his men and they had to sail through these sirens, who are these sea monsters who sing the most beautiful song in the world, and when sailors would hear their song, they would dive to the water and dive to their doom because the sirens would then kill them. So Odysseus, wanting to hear the songs but not wanting to die, asked his men to tie him to the mast of his ship and then plugged his men's ears with beeswax so that they couldn't hear the songs as they rode past the sirens. And so that way Odysseus was pre-committed to something. He was tied to the mast so he could hear the songs, but he wouldn't be able to jump into the water. And that's kind of a really good analogy for what a commitment device is in behavioral science. So in behavioral science, a commitment device is basically tying someone and holding somebody accountable so that they don't engage in the wrong behavior later on. So for example, you could say, let me set this goal of achieving this much work done by this time. If I reach that goal, I'll donate £20 to my favorite charity. Whereas if I fail that goal, I will have to donate £100 to a charity I absolutely hate. And by doing that kind of commitment device, you're able to hold people to a stronger behavior. In terms of behavioral interventions, I don't actually know that many examples of how this is being used out in the real world other than kind of self-hacking. So for that reason, I'm going to put it in C tier along with the IKEA effect, because I just don't know of that many examples where it's been used successfully. However, if you know some examples of where commitment devices have been used successfully and you think that it belongs in the higher tier, let me know in the comments below. Okay, next up we have defaults, and defaults go straight into S tier. So if you're watching this, I assume you know what a default is, but just in case, defaults are basically this. It's a checkbox, and a checkbox works so that when people are offered option A or option B, a default will have one of those options pre-selected for them. And defaults are probably the most boring of all behavioral science interventions, psychologically speaking anyway. You're just setting an option for somebody else and then letting the choice architecture run itself. They are super effective. Depending on the context, they could have effect sizes of up to 90% plus behavior change. They're also really easy to implement because you literally just have to pre-select an option for a group of people, and as long as that's ethically okay, you can do that. So defaults are just instant S tier, super easy, low hanging fruit, and potentially really, really powerful. So S tier. Okay, almost done. So the next one is empathy gap. So if you don't know what an empathy gap is, we usually use it in reference to hot and cold states of being. Now, what does that mean? So when we're in a hot state, that means that we are not able to use our brains very well due to the kind of mood or emotional state that we're in. So for example, we can think about when we're angry, when we're hungry, when we're stressed, or when we're sexually aroused. These tend to be described as hot states where our judgment, our system 2 thinking, our slow, rational brain is not really working at its best in these situations. And so by using an empathy gap intervention, what we're trying to do is we're trying to get people to either cool down before making their decision, or we're trying to get people to pre-make their decision in the cool state so that they are committed to it later on in the hot state. So empathy gap is actually a really important idea for a lot of different behavioral science fields. For example, trying to prevent behaviors like domestic violence, like sexual assault in clubs and alcoholism. These are really important issues that the empathy gap helps to address. And even on a lighter note, empathy gap can be also used to solve things like trying to eat a healthier lunch, right? Because what often happens is that we get really hungry at lunchtime, and even though we're trying to stick to our diet and maybe lose some weight, when we get really hungry, we can't really resist eating those unhealthy foods around us. And so ways we can use empathy gap is we can say, well, if you prep your food ahead of time when you're not super hungry, maybe the night before, then when you bring that food to work the next day, you're not going to feel very tempted to eat the unhealthy food. When you're hungry, you'll just eat the food that you brought with you. And so that's a good way to use empathy gap to change people's behavior. I think it's a really important idea. However, I don't think it applies to many behavioral interventions because a lot of the decisions that we're making aren't made in strong emotional states. And so our emotional state wouldn't have a huge influence on our decision making all the time. So while it can be useful for some situations, I don't think it's that versatile. And so for that reason, it's going into the middle of the road B category. So last on our list is framing. So framing is rephrasing our information in a different way to promote different decisions. So none of the information is changing. The only thing we're changing is how that information is presented to our decision maker. And the usual example of this is to do with diseases and a cure for that disease, which seems super duper relevant right now. So imagine we're treating our population, 100% of our population, with a particular cure for a very deadly disease. And we can say, okay, so if we take this type of safety measure to combat the disease, we're going to either save 60% of our population, or you can reframe that same information and say, if we take this policy, we're going to kill 40% of our population. Now, the information hasn't changed. Saving 60% and killing 40% is exactly the same information, but somehow the killing 40% makes people much more unlikely to want to take that deal. So framing can be really powerful for getting people to think about decisions differently. I think that framing is powerful and versatile, but it's not quite worthy of S tier, so I'm going to put framing in A tier. So this is my final tier list. I don't know what you guys think. Do you agree, disagree? Yes, no, maybe so? Let me know in the comments below. And don't forget to subscribe to my channel, and I'll see you in the next video. Bye bye.